Good morning and welcome to another interesting episode of Logistics with Purpose. I'm your host, Enrique Alvarez, and I'm here with Kristi, my co-host. How are you doing today, Kristi?
I'm good, thanks. I'm glad to be here. It's always going to be a good day for us when we get to have one of these interviews. So it'll be another good interview. How do we get to talk such amazing people? I'm like, oh, we have such great jobs to be able to have these conversations. So today's going to be another good one. Someone you met, actually.
Yes, I had the pleasure of meeting the our guest today at the CEO Summit, Conscious Capitalism Community, and he's actually some people call him the CEO Whisperer. I just had an
Mm.
amazing session with him, and I think that it's going to be interesting for everyone. I feel like we're all ready for a master class in reflection and and I see our guest laughing a little bit about it. So go ahead, Chrissy. Why don't you just
Yes.
do us the honors and introduce our guest?
Absolutely. Well, please, a big logistics with purpose. Welcome to Jerry Colonna, certified professional coach, author, named to Forbes ASAP list of best VCs and Worth It's list of the most 25 generous young Americans. He is the CEO and co-founder of Reboot IO. Jerry, welcome. Thanks so much for your time and being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Kristi, and thanks, Enrique. And I was laughing because every time I hear that phrase, the CEO whisper, I think I have to get really, really like close to the microphone and get kind of sexy as I talk. So,
Um, well, thank you for being here, Jerry. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and thank you once again. So, before we get started and listen to a little bit of your journey, I will ask some quick questions and see if you can just respond with the first thing that comes to mind. You ready?
I'm ready.
All
Speed
right.
round.
Yeah.
Let's do it. This is the speed round for 50 points. Here we go. Jerry Colonna. What's your favorite hobby?
Can I call a friend for that? No, just kidding.
Lifelines are not existent in this particular game.
Uh, I would say reading.
Hmm.
I read about 2 books a week.
Wow.
All right. What's one thing you do to stay productive?
Oh Lord, I am obsessively compulsive about getting shit done. Excuse me, can I curse?
You can always curse.
So,
Yes.
here's the best way to answer that. In a world where people are drowning in email, I am a zero inbox kind of guy,
Wow.
and I have been for 35 years. So, if you want to get my attention, email me. That's what happens. So,
Wow.
and that's how you're so lucky to get me on because you just emailed. So, anyway,
There you go. What's one thing? Oh, favorite book. What's your favorite besides yours, of course?
Of course.
Hmm. Let me answer it this way. There are 3 books that I would argue saved my life, and they are Let Your Life Speak by Parker Palmer, who is a Quaker writer and teacher. Faith by Sharon Salzberg, who is a Buddhist writer and teacher, and When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron. And I first read those 3 books, uh, I want to say in 2002, and they changed the course of my life for the better.
Oh, well,
How's
we'll
that for
have
a
to add.
tease?
The
That
testimonial.
was that's incredible. We're going to put the links to all those books in when we post your conversation. And thanks for sharing.
Mm.
Favorite place to be?
Home. I live on a farm with my wife and 4 horses in the foothills of the Rockies. And yeah, so I would say home, and second place might be Yankee Stadium in October.
Oh,
So,
wow.
because the
So
Yankees usually play baseball in October. Just want to say that out loud.
it's a really good reminder for everyone that's listening that's not particularly keen to baseball or in this country, but quote that inspires you.
Um, there are 2 that I have posted on my computer right now because that's what I usually do. And to be clear, I have a file of almost 5,000 quotes that
Wow.
I have amassed over the years in reading different books. So I'm obsessive about them. But these are two. The first is life is to be lived, not controlled. And humanity is won by continuing to play in the face of certain defeat. Our fate is to become one, and yet many. This is not prophecy, but description. And that's by Ralph Ellison, who wrote Invisible Man.
Beautiful.
And the second is actually a quote from myself. How's that for narcissism? Um, so I mentioned Parker's book a few minutes ago. Parker and Pema and Sharon have all become very, very close friends of mine over the years. And in April, I think, last April, I was visiting Parker at his home in Wisconsin. And he just turned 86. So he's one of my elders. And after spending an afternoon with him talking about all the things we could possibly talk about, I came away saying to myself, what matters, Jerry, is what matters. And it's a quote that reminds me that I can forget what actually matters. And I can get all wrapped around the axle worrying about stuff that just doesn't matter. So those are the two quotes on my writing desk as we speak.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. I want to hear so much more, but we also have a lot to cover and you have a lot of insight and wisdom to share. So let's start with your background. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up, your childhood, what's your origin story?
Oh, I wrote a 350-page book about that. My God.
I know. I'm going to ask you to chat GPT summarize it right now.
Oh my God, you just stabbed the heart of a writer.
Same. I'm with you.
I think what you're getting at is I grew up in Brooklyn. I am number 6 of 7 kids. I grew up in a household that was, by any standards, relatively poor, relatively challenged. My father was alcoholic and my mother was mentally ill, which created an enormous amount of both emotional and physical violence in the family. I grew up in a time, and I wrote about this seriously in both books, Reboot and Reunion. I grew up in a time of a lot of cultural and sociological turmoil in Brooklyn. There was a lot of tension that existed in the streets. And in the middle of 7th grade, we moved to a different part of Brooklyn, which was a primarily Italian-American section called Bensonhurst. I lived there for a few years. Then we moved to Queens, which is another part of the city. The city has 5 boroughs, and this was a different area. And then I went from there, I went to college at City University of New York, Queens College. And then I started my career first as a reporter and journalist for a technology magazine, and then moved my way up through the ranks of that company. When I was just about 30 years old, I became a venture capitalist. So in that introduction that you gave, that reference to being on the Forbes ASAP list, that's about 35 years old. So that's an old bio.
Still counts.
It still counts, damn it.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And before you get a little bit too ahead of ourselves here, Jerry, because you have an incredible career and actually want to touch upon a couple of those maybe years more carefully. But do you remember from those early years, like a story or something, an experience that kind of shaped or started shaping the Jerry that is you now?
Oh, so many. And if my kids were listening, they would laugh because dad has lots of stories.
You are a very
Um,
good storyteller, that's for sure.
well, you know what? I think stories, I often think about us as community members sitting around campfires, telling stories to make sense of the world.
Mm.
And I think that we don't do a good enough job of telling stories. It's a lost art, if you will. Um, but I think that there were a number of stories I could tell. Probably the most meaningful of which would be there's a story that, you know, there's my life before this event and my life after this event. And as I mentioned kind of quickly before, there was a lot of mental illness in my family. And as number 6 of 7, I internalized the responsibility of being the good boy. I was the one who was not going to give anybody any trouble. And I was going to be almost to the point where I'd be, and this is a favorite word of mine, complicit in my own diminishment. Um, when I was a kid, a very young kid, there was, and I tell this story in Reboot, there was an old chestnut tree that was on our street. And it was somewhat diseased, and there was a big crack in the tree, and it was large enough that one could, if you're small enough, as I was, you could sort of step into that. And that tree was incredibly important in my life. I know this sounds odd, but it sort of set the stage for a lifelong connection to nature and trees specifically. When my household would get unbearably out of control, when my parents would fight, and we lived on the ground floor of a 3-story building, and you could hear the fights out into the streets because the windows would be open and it'd be summertime and it's hot, and the street was filled with my friends, and they could hear my parents fighting. So let's just pause. And can you feel the shame? And they would be yelling at each other, and I would disappear into that tree. Um, this feeling that I had of there, but not there, part of the family, but not part of the family, I realize in hindsight was a kind of safety mechanism. And in many, many ways, that tree became a sanctuary for me. Years later, I came home from school one day and I heard backhoes and dump trucks, and the Parks Department, which was responsible for the trees in New York City, had just cut down that tree. And I still feel for that tree. I still smell the sawdust. Um, I remember running home to my mother and just crying that it was gone. It was gone. And she had no idea what I was talking about. But it was the place that meant so much to me.
Mm.
Decades and decades and decades later, on this farm where my wife and I live, um, there's a tree, what's called a cottonwood, which is very popular in the Southwest, that is at the center of the farm. And that cottonwood's got to be 150 years old. And we have this beautiful platform built underneath it. And I wrote about this in Reunion. Decades after he passed, I was sitting under that tree when I told my father about Allie, my wife. And even though he wasn't physically with us, I felt his presence. And I very much feel that that tree was a container for those experiences. So,
Mhm.
yeah, who knew that I
Yeah.
was going to tell you about the tree?
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing such a powerful story.
Mhm.
Yeah. I was in Gettysburg a couple of weeks ago and doing an audio tour, and one of the stops on it was a very large tree that was probably over 150 years old, it said, but I didn't realize this, but they called them, which you may know, it was kind of commonly known as like a witness tree or a listening tree or something like
Mhm.
that because of all of the history that it had absorbed during its years. And so that kind of reminded me of your story just now, but thank you for sharing that with us.
You're welcome. And you know, it is important to remember that the earth remembers, that nature remembers. I remember during the pandemic, I'm sitting in my home office and I look off to my right and I see the Rocky Mountains. And I remember during the worst years of the pandemic being able to look out and there's a peak that I can see very clearly called Long's Peak. And I remember thinking, Long's Peak doesn't care. It really doesn't care. I mean, it is a witness, to use your word, Kristi. Um, and sometimes when we get wrapped up in things that don't matter, it's helpful to remember these non-human beings
Mhm.
who can sort of land us in what really matters. And, you know, like your tree at Gettysburg, the cottonwood on this property dates to around the time Colorado was sliced off of Kansas and Nebraska territory, and the land was taken from the indigenous people, and a state with very square corners
Mhm.
was created. Um, we have irrigation ditches that run through our property from which, you know, our pastures are watered that predate the founding of this state.
Mhm.
And it's 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 important to remember.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Um, Well, it sounds like you were born in the city, but you have that country streak within you that has really made a lot of peace and a lot of adjustment there. And you've had a lot of really interesting shifts in your life and in your career. You mentioned a second ago moving into investing at 30, which has got to be also just super interesting. That seems like a really young age to go into something like that. You launched Flatiron, so that was an investing program. Then you went to CMG Ventures and CMP Media, coaching. So you've done a lot of different things, kind of always around growth, always around investing in others, whether that would be financially or through coaching or through something else. So I'm curious what was kind of the path that you carved out? What kind of led to some of those significant transitions?
Well, to get the chronology right,
Sure.
I started off working at CMP.
Okay.
Then I started working at CMG. And then I started working at Flatiron. Well, I
Okay.
launched Flatiron, which was backed by JPMP, JP Morgan Partners. Um, but I think that, yeah, and you know, you could say that I've never actually been able to hold a job for very long. Um, no, I think that there are a couple of common threads, and this is the benefit of hindsight. You know, I'm
Sure.
61 now, and this adult career started when I was 21. So we're talking about a 40-year time frame. And I would say that one of the things that binds everything that I've ever done, aside from storytelling, is rooted in a childhood adaptation that I would describe as hypervigilance. So to take it back, to grow up in a household with challenged parents, to grow up in the household either with implicit potential violence or actual violence, one way we survive is to always be on guard
Sure.
and to
Right.
always read the room and to watch for a little flicker of an eyebrow that might indicate, I don't know, a glass thrown across the room, right? Some folks grow into adulthood with that kind of hypervigilance, and it becomes persistent anxiety. And I had that. But I also developed an ability to understand and feel the other person's feelings. Enrique, you may have experienced that when we met at the summit,
Right.
because oftentimes I won't necessarily respond to the question that's put in front of me. I respond to the question that's behind the question, right? The feeling that's going on there. And I think the most significant thing I did in developing my adult career, and I don't mean career in adult films, I mean in my adult career, was my ability to use that skill set to advance what it was that I was doing, whether it was as a reporter trying to get at what really the story was, or as an investor trying to understand what the entrepreneur was really about, or now as a coach or as a writer, being able to sort of get at what the real issue is. The truth is, I'm really, really uncomfortable with unnamed elephants in the room.
Mm.
You know that experience where we're all sitting there, and whether it's at work where, El Jefe, the big boss, is saying something and everybody disagrees with it, but nobody's saying anything.
Right.
I'm the schmuck who says something,
Right.
and I have always been, right? And that's it. That stems from that very experience that I was describing before.
Well,
Mm.
and do you think, Jerry, that some of that you just shared with us actually was the driving force towards then becoming a coach? I feel like that kind of superpower, if you want to call it somehow, of really reading into other people's feelings that well, kind of cope with the I need to speak up my mind when I need to. Is that something? Tell us a little bit more about how you kind of went into the coaching side of your career.
Well, to your question, I think you're helping me see a connection that I hadn't seen before, so thank you. Um, we were talking about the hypervigilance, that superpower, helping me see things that others may not be seeing. And then this tendency of whether or not I say something, right? And so I joked about being the guy who actually says something. I wasn't always that guy. And there's a story I tell that occurred right at the beginning of my career as an investor. And briefly, I went to the beach with my kid's mom, my former wife, and our kids. And I passed through one section under the boardwalk, and I came out into the sun, and I was struck down by this incredible migraine. I was just knocked on my ass by this. So bad that I went to the emergency room, and so confusing, they kept me for about 5 days worth of testing. And at the very end, they kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, "We don't know what happened. It was just bad." I went into therapy the next week. I went to see my therapist, a woman I'd been seeing for many years. And she said in a kind of exasperated tone, "What are you not saying that you need to say? What are you not saying that you need to say?" And the truth is, I had grown up not saying things that I needed to say. And it had gotten to the point where the not unsaid things became somaticized and pain points in my body. And the migraine was just one of many migraines I had. And so I began trying to train myself to say the thing that needs to be said. And now I can't shut up. So
Well, it's one of those things that you keep building and building, and you just don't have anything to actually let them go. Then just the pressure accumulates,
that's
like
right.
the very famous Seinfeld episode of Serenity Now. I don't know if you guys
That's
are. I don't know.
right.
If you're, that's what came to mind when you were telling the story. I'm like,
That's
this
right.
is this
That's
is
funny.
George. This is George's dad. Um, no, so changing gears a little bit here, Jerry. Reboot IO, right?
Yeah,
Tell us a little bit more. You're the CEO and co-founder of this, and can you share, well, for people that don't know what it is, a little bit more about what it is, and then a little bit more about the purpose and the core principles that drive such a, I would say, unique coaching methodology. Is that fair?
unique and world's best.
And
No,
world's best is the other thing that I was going to
Yes.
add. Absolutely. No, and that's I think what you're when you spoke at the CEO summit, it was about that, and you're right, it was very impressive. So if you can tell us a little bit more to our audience about what it is and what you
Sure,
do as a CEO and co-founder of Reboot, that would be great.
sure. So, we founded Reboot uh, almost 11 years ago now, about 10 and a half years ago. And it is, executive coaching, leadership development firm. Um, it grew out of my previous 10, 15 years as an executive coach, where I was a solo entrepreneur. And one of my motivations for getting together with my co-founders which include, by the way, my now wife, Allie, um, uh, was that well, first of all, I wanted collaborators, but I also knew that there was important work we could only do in a group, work we could only do together. So, like many, many firms, we provide individualized executive coaching services. Um, we do have a bit of a twist, and the twist is I had a colleague once who used to describe it as we smuggle in consciousness. And so, what we try to do is appeal to the stated wishes. Teach me how to be a good CEO, for example. And then what we smuggle in is this notion of how to be a better person. So if you go back to try to understand what it is that we do, um, we have a saying that better humans make better leaders. And, as soon as I say that, it's kind of obvious, well, of course, right? But what really begs the question of, well, why do we have such terrible leadership? If it's so simple.
Right,
Right.
right.
And we have terrible leadership, whether it's in politics or our communities or in our businesses. It's because what I would call the act of growing up, the act of becoming a better human, is really, really hard.
Mm.
Like so hard that we're socialized to not do the things that we're supposed to do. Like ask ourselves, what am I not saying that I need to say? Or how have I been complicit in creating the very conditions I complain about all the time? How have I participated in it? How have I benefited from the conditions in the world that I say I don't like? And what am I willing to give up that I love in order to have that world that I see? Um, so Reboot's approach to coaching is much more focused around helping that person become their fullest possible self, and then using that as the basis to answer those nagging questions of how do I fire people? How do I hire people? How do I fundraise? How do I deal with uncertainty in the marketplace? You speak to so many people in logistics right now. I mean, where are the tariffs going? I don't know. What is
No
this
one
going to do?
really
I don't
knows.
know.
Right.
How do you hold your seat as a leader
Right.
in a world that is turned upside down and shaken like a snow globe every 2 weeks?
Mhm.
Right?
Which I'm
It turn
guessing will probably be the norm going forward, right? I feel like all these changes are just happening more rapidly. I know it has to do with technology, with the culture, with our generations. What I'm saying
I
is
you know
reboot is
I
going to be even more important as we keep developing as humans, because it feels like changes just are
well I
happening
would say
faster.
that I don't worry about my business model going away.
Right,
Uh, but
right.
I will say this, Enrique. I think when we're faced with lots of uncertainty, we can get, I wrote about this in LinkedIn on LinkedIn essay a few weeks ago. We can get ahistorical. We can forget the past,
Mm.
and we can identify this particular time as a time of great difficulty. And that's not to say that this time is not a time of great difficulty. It is. And there are great divisions in American society, but not just American, across the world. And we have been here before.
Right, right.
And it's really important to remember that we have been here before because um, our elders remember.
Well,
And
and
they can,
Jerry,
go ahead.
no, to the same article that you actually are referring to, I believe. I think you said, and let me see if I get this quote right. History is not what happened, but also what we choose to forget. And I thought that was
Yes.
very, very powerful, right? Because I never thought about history that way, and I think you're right. We very selectively forget about a bunch of different things, but that doesn't mean that they didn't happen.
Mhm.
Yeah. In Reunion, I talk about the gauzy myth that defines us, both, oftentimes at our family, right? So we tell stories from generation to generation. And we do this at the national level. We do this even at the business level. The origin stories tend to turn out really well.
Mhm.
Right.
And we forget, or as I often describe it, we dismember instead of remembering. We dismember uncomfortable facts and truths, right? I have a colleague who identifies as queer, and her family, she grew up with a family obsessed with their family tree. They wrote it down in the Bible and they passed it from generation to generation. And one day she just asked herself, what happened to my queer ancestors? They're not identified. Or what happened to this ancestor who, I have an ancestor who was transported from Ireland to Australia for stealing a cow. And the family story was he stole back the cow from the baron who had taken it because it was the only source of food for the family. What happens to these people?
Right.
I mean, this is what I meant when I said history is not only what we choose to remember, but it's also what we forget.
Mhm.
We forget what we have struggled through, and we craft a myth of who we are.
Mhm. Yes, that gives me a lot to think about that I will
Mhm.
continue thinking about. Thank you. And I'm going to go back and read your LinkedIn story too, and we'll put it in the show notes as well.
Mhm.
So speaking of crafting, uh, people say there's no specific formula for success. However, you have figured one out. And so your great formula for enhanced leadership. So I'm going to read it twice for our audience who is listening along. But then I want to dig into it a little bit more, how it's applicable, how you came up with it. So the formula goes practical skills plus radical self-inquiry plus shared experiences equals enhanced leadership and greater resilience. So again, practical skills plus radical self-inquiry plus shared experiences equals enhanced leadership and greater resilience. So how did you come up with this?
Well, the honest truth is I was doing a sort of talk in front of a group of people, and I was trying to explain my approach to coaching. And as is often the case, I had my shoes off and I was running around the room. Enrique, you've seen me speak, so you know
Yep.
the energy. And all of a sudden, I pulls this dry erase board on wheels and I just sketched that out very quickly. And what I was trying to explain was if you look at the top half of that equation, and I structure it as an equation, I was trying to explain what I was getting to before, which is that oftentimes people come to a coach freaked out about the how.
Mm-hmm.
How do I do with this job? You know, so many people reach out for coaching because they've just been promoted. Congratulations, now I'm screwed. What do I do? Right? I don't know how to do this job. What do I do? And so they come in looking for those practical skills. And then I drive them crazy and I say, well, tell me about your father, right? Um, uh, but the point of that dialectical tension has to do with a lot of the stuff we've already talked about before. I can read every book in the world and still encounter something that is a challenge for my practical skills.
Sure.
What I really need to do is understand how I'm organized as an adult. What are the things that I carry forth from my childhood? What are my tendencies? Am I conflict avoidant? Thus making feedback sessions much more difficult for me. And by understanding the interplay between, say, who I am through radical self-inquiry and those practical skills, I'm going to grow more. The other component of that is the experience of breaking through the isolation and sharing what's going on, whether it's with peers or with a coach or with a therapist or whatever. And to my point, that results in not only being a better leader, but more importantly, being better able to withstand the vicissitudes of leadership. Because this job is hard.
Yeah.
So, and I often will say in front of a group, I'm mostly concerned about making sure you don't hurt yourself, or that you don't destroy your marriage, or you don't become estranged from your kids because you were socialized to place work above all else in your life. So that's the equation. It happens to be a very, very handy way of understanding all things that we do, because we try to tap into all three of the things on top.
Well,
Fantastic.
and you published your book, Reboot, Leadership and the Art of Growing Up in 2019. The word art stands out for me. Why did you choose the word art, and how does it reflect in your approach to leadership?
Well, thanks for lifting that up. I don't think I've ever had that question before, so I want to acknowledge that. The last line of Reboot, before the afterward, is, and with that, I mastered the art of growing up. And I call it an art because we're socialized to think of it as a science.
Mm.
And more important, I described it as mastering the art of growing up, not, and with that, I grew up. Because the other thing that I want to call forth is not only is it a felt sense, but it's also a practice that is never ending.
Right.
Right? I'm going to continue growing up until I take my last breath. And once you internalize that, because as soon as I say it, it's kind of logical. I can see it on both of your faces. You're like, well, yeah, that makes sense. But once you internalize that, what do you drop? You end up dropping the self-criticism and the self-judgment that says, why do I still struggle with this? Oh, right. I'm still in my process. I'm still in the art. The growing up part is the tongue-in-cheek part of saying better humans make better leaders. More adult humans make better leaders. That's what that means.
You mentioned a couple of examples, but is there any particular from the book, like any key insight that you think the readers can gain from the book itself, as it kind of relates to their leadership skills? Something maybe a couple more practical insights from
Well,
the book.
I think that Reboot will be 6 years old this June, which is shocking to me. I think the most significant takeaway that people can get from that book, because what I do is I use memoir and stories from my clients' lives to illustrate various points, like what is our relationship to money and how does that impact every aspect of our career choices, those sorts of things. Let me just pause. Are you guys hearing the vacuum cleaner outside? No.
Nope.
Okay,
Nope.
great. I think that the thing that struck me after Reboot came out, and it still happens to this day, the thing that struck me was, even though I tell these very personal stories about my own journey, and I put myself out there in a way that we're not often socialized to do, the thing that occurred was a phenomena which I wrote about in Reunion, the shorthand of which is "Your story is my story." And I want to highlight this because this is a really important understanding, I think, both as adults and as leaders. There was this phenomena that occurred, the best example of which was there was a book reading I did in Dublin in December 2019, so a few months after the book came out. And the room was filled with blonde-haired, blue-eyed Irish folks, not surprising. And I was reading a section about what happens to us as children when one or more of our caregivers or our parents are either emotionally or physically unavailable, and how it accelerates our own what's called early parentification. We grow up fast, and how there's a correlation with leadership. Many leaders have experienced some form of this. And in the very front row, there was a Black woman who was furiously taking a lot of notes as I was talking. And at the end of the talk, she came up to me and started telling me her story. And she said, you know, that thing that you talked about that happens to kids, that happened to me. My father died when I was 13 or 14, I forget the age. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. And I was kind of floaty because I'd just been doing a talk. And then she said something that really struck me. She said, yeah, he was killed on Robben Island. And Robben Island is the prison that Nelson Mandela was held in. And she went on to tell me that he had been a freedom fighter based in Zimbabwe who had been caught on the border between Zimbabwe and South Africa, taken to the prison and beaten to death. And then she said to me, your story is my story. And I was blown away because I grew up in Brooklyn. I had a tree outside, right? I was like, I was not. And yet there was a connection between us. And the reason I highlight this, Enrique, is because the thing that we can lose sight of is that there's so much about our sociological and psychological makeup that is common.
Right.
And
Right.
that when we are encountering somebody at work who's just driving us crazy, it's really helpful to remember that just like us, All they want is love, safety, and belonging, right? Just like us, they're terrified of certain things. And just like us, they get angry at certain things. And what that induces, when we can internalize that, is probably the most important force. I know it's not in favor these days, but the most important force of for anybody who holds power. And that's empathy
Hmm.
and compassion. We live in a world right now, where empathy is identified as the problem. And as God is my witness, I think it's the only path forward. Is to look across the screen and it's like, I can feel it. You guys are relating to the
Absolutely.
things that I tell you. You're looking back in your own lives and you're saying, where is this similar? Where is this different? And then we end this phone call and we have this shared experience. So the most important takeaway, think of it as both books, if you will. Think of it as use radical self-inquiry to find the empathetic connection, to overcome that which holds us back from creating the world we want to see,
Mm.
whether it's in our business or in our communities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm curious, you mentioned, of course, makes a lot of sense. People come to you wanting to know, you've worked with all kinds of leaders, most people wanting to show up and want to how do I do this? How do I get better at this? What's the process? What's the formula? That's kind of, innately what we're all looking for. And then you show them this other side and ask them these other questions. So I'm curious, what are some of these other kind of commonalities that you see? We do have a lot of listeners that are leaders. I guess everybody leads somebody. So what are some common challenges that you observed, and what would you give them to help overcome that? Whether it's a question to ask, something to practice, just get outside more. I don't know. What is that a piece of advice?
So rather than tell, I'm going to show.
Okay.
Okay, so Kristi, as you're asking that question, was there any relation? Did you relate whatsoever to the challenge of how do I do my job, and that experience? Any connection to that for you in your own life experience?
Yeah, I think as you get to the next level, you always ask how. For me, it's in marketing, the how is always I guess what is mine is more of a how, what, in that what do I need to focus on? Because there's so much, even as you talked about, just in the world around us, there's so much always coming at you. So knowing how to narrow that to the right message and list of tasks, and how do I connect better with my people and also get my job done? Those kinds of things come up for me a lot.
Yeah. So stay with that feeling for a
Okay.
moment. Okay. How does it feel when you don't have an answer to those questions?
Frustrating.
Um, what, if anything, do you tell yourself about yourself when you don't have an answer?
Uh, Probably more like I just need to figure this out. There's got to be an answer and I need to figure it
There's
out.
got to be an answer. I need to figure it out. How long have you done that?
Oh, for decades.
All right. So now what we've just done is, okay, we've just identified an early pattern, which is that Kristi carries a point of view about the way she's supposed to know something. When she encounters not knowing how to do something, she gets a little angry, maybe even a little frightened, maybe even a little self-critical. And then she doubles down and finds a way to get the answer. And behind that might be a whole set of emotional experiences. Does that feel familiar?
Yes, it's just like talking to my other counselor, so maybe I should pick you guys up.
Okay. But here's the important point there. How did I know that about you, Kristi?
Expertise and longevity of doing this,
The
years of
hypervigilance
experience.
that I was talking about before.
Mm.
I tuned in, I listened. And don't worry, I'll turn to Enrique in the next minute.
Oh no, I'm
The
take your time. Kristi needs all the help.
the
Oh, is it time to end the interview already? Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
but here's the breakthrough. I'll bet that the people who report to you feel similarly.
Sure.
Can you feel that?
Yeah.
So now, as you think about your own leadership, staying in touch with that part of you, which is a very old, or to put it another way, a very young part of you, right? Staying in touch with that young part of you with compassion can become the bridge by which you then connect to the people that report to you. Because chances are pretty good you've unconsciously recreated that phenomena within the team. So that's
Okay.
what we do. And so when you are struggling and not sure what to do, if you can let go of the notion that you're supposed to have all the answers, but instead turn towards the team, you'll have not only the shared experience, but you'll sort of lift them up and model for them what I often say is blowing a kiss to that part of you that wants to criticize you for not having an answer, and then lift up this other experience of being in a team where it becomes a puzzle that you work towards figuring out, not evidence of your own unworthiness.
Mm.
So let me just pause because I said I was going to show you and not tell you.
Wow.
Do you see what I mean when I said show you?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Right? Because I could have just laid that all out intellectually. But the thing about intellectual learning versus experiential learning, it just doesn't land as well. Right? And so I wanted to take you through an experience more than anything else.
Yeah.
I hope that that was okay.
Yes, it was. Yes. It's a familiar conversation, like I said.
It was very, very impressive to witness from my standpoint
Yeah, what were
of
you
view.
feeling, Enrique, was I was doing that?
The actual interaction with you and Kristi,
Yeah,
or just the
yeah,
question?
yeah, the actual
I was
interaction.
I was curious to see where you were going because, of course, I know Kristi fairly
Mm,
well. We've been working together for a long, long time, and
mm,
I didn't know where you were going to land. And yeah, it's we have talked about what you guys discussed and like
mm,
many, many times as well. So
mm,
I was
mm.
just curious.
And what about for you? Anything that you related to?
Oh yeah, no, I feel the same way, right? How do you prioritize things?
Mm,
How do you make sure that you're focusing on the right things at the right time? And um so I definitely related to all that. I think Christy and I share some of that as well from a personality standpoint. So it's that kind of um driving through being stubborn and sheer power and not giving up. That's a lot of
mm.
what I do. And of course, it feels exhausting from time to time. And I can totally see the steps to what you're going to say next. And yeah, that's something that reflects in the team sometimes.
Well, here's a simple question to hold on to, maybe not so simple, but you don't even have to answer the question in this forum. How long have I carried that pattern?
Right.
And how has that pattern served me? And how has that pattern, what, if any, obstacles has that pattern created for me?
Right.
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 And those are examples of a kind of radical self-inquiry. Radical because we tend not to actually pause and ask ourselves a question like that. Oh, here's that thing I've been doing since I was 8 years old. Boy, it was really handy because it got me out of that situation and this situation. But right now, it's fueling a lot of stress. It's fueling a lot of anxiety. I kind of don't need that anymore because I'm here, not where I was when I developed the pattern.
And so I just reminded of something that I and I'll send it to you when I find it, but it's a TED Talk. I forgot whose TED Talk it was, but it compared two types of leaders. Shackleton on one end and then Atmussen on the other. And I think
Mm.
Shackleton tried 4 times, failed 4 times. Everyone was a drama, everyone was dying and he survived because he was a survivor. But then this other explorer Adamson, who actually tried 3 things and he was the first to the poles and the first to her, and no one talks about him. So I was wondering if there's something about the drama that the media picks up because Adamson, there's only 2 books written about Adamson. And if you had to pick, and this was the whole point about this TED Talk, is like, who would you pick if you wanted a leader for your expedition? And the answer is clear. You pick Adamson all the time, but we think of Shackleton as the leadership and the great leader, and he was not he was not the best leader. He failed every time, but everyone thinks that he's the strongest leader, and
Yeah. Yeah. So,
that's
I mean,
similar to what you said, I think.
yeah, I haven't seen that talk, and I know a little bit about because I was obsessed about um, explorers, those explorers in particular. And I used to have a client, Ben Saunders, who holds a number of Arctic and Antarctic exploration records.
Mm.
So that's a whole nother conversation. What are the key differences between those two was Edmondson was criticized because he went, quote, native and used dog teams to achieve his objectives, which is what the Inuit people did to survive in the environment. And he wore clothing that was very similar to their clothing. And guess what? It worked,
It
right?
worked well.
Um, but I think you're touching upon a really interesting phenomena, and I would encourage you to read a book called "The Myth of the Strong Leader"
Mm.
by Archie Brown. And Brown pulls apart the mythology that we build up and maintain around uncompromising, inflexible, what we often assume are gritty leaders who force their way through in an authoritarian way. And I'll say this again because we need a reminder that authoritarian leadership historically is the worst kind of leadership.
Right.
It is very effective in the short term, but it doesn't create the kinds of transformation or sustainability that we really strive for. And Shackleton, for all sorts of British socialization and the Victorian era or Edwardian era belief systems about what the British were supposed to do, um, was just rigid and uncompromising and killed people. Um, I think I don't think we glorify the failure. I think we glorify the rigidity
Mm.
because, and I think it's a reaction because we get so scared of our own uncertainty and our own knowing that we're easily susceptible to someone who promises us the answer. And the result is that we're constantly falling for the strong leader.
Mm.
And especially if the strong leader is narcissistic enough to pretend that only they have the answer. Right.
Which we can find a lot of those examples these days, and where the truth is we might need a lot of the others. But
That's right. That's right.
Jerry, thank you so much. This has been incredible. And we can't thank you enough for spending some time with us.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm confused because we need to talk about logistics.
That's what happens all the time, by the
It
way.
does.
It's
Logistics is
logistics with
everything.
purpose.
Yeah.
And that's our official answer. Logistics is everything.
Logistics is
But
everything. We
Well,
talked to the
thank
leaders of logistics today. So that was really good. And before we want to go, this was totally unplanned, but we will be releasing this episode during Mental Health Month. And so I think what you talked about actually relates really
Right.
well to that. And so I want to ask you one more question, which touches back on something you mentioned early on. But what is a question we can ask ourselves to become better humans?
What am I not saying that I need to say?
Okay.
The other question I would offer, I'm known for this question, which is how have I been complicit in creating the conditions I say I don't want? And I caution about that question because people will often turn that into how have I been responsible for all the miserable stuff in my life? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, how have I helped along the things that I think I don't want? And what do I have to give up that I love in order to change and have the life that I really want? So,
Good. Thank you.
Wow.
thank
Jerry,
you.
how can our listeners connect with you? You mentioned email earlier, but I think LinkedIn, you
Yeah,
also,
LinkedIn is great. You know, I think my profile is Jerry Colonna is very simple. Same thing. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on Instagram. That's all. But the best place is reboot.io.
Perfect.
We have a newsletter. You can figure out where I'm talking next and what am I up to next, because my team is trying to keep up with me. Where are you speaking next, Jerry? So that's me.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for spending time with us. This was terrific, and I can see exactly why after Enrique saw you speak, he said, we've got to have this guy on. So thanks for your time today. For everybody listening, thank you as always for your time. If you enjoyed this conversation, then be sure to hit subscribe because we'll have another amazing episode in 2 weeks. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.